Okay, welcome everybody. This is Simon Turpin of AIG UK, and since we're all stuck indoors still, we're continuing to do some of our interviews with different creation speakers, and I'm really pleased that I can be joined today by someone who used to hold my job, Paul Taylor, who is now across the pond in America, and Paul is just going to tell you a bit about himself, what he does now, what he used to do here in the UK, and some of the books he's written. So, Paul, it's good to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to chat with you. It's good. It's going to be good fun. Yeah, I'm Paul Taylor. I'm the director of the Mount St Helens Creation Centre, which is a tiny little ministry based at Mount St Helens in Washington State. And you did suggest before, Simon, that I might have a presentation in front of me, and I'm just looking here because there's a useful map here if I can find
flip it up.
Which might be of use just to show. Yeah, here's the one. So if I bring that up there, and then I think there's a button here that you told me to press. There we go. So yes, is that on the screen now? Can that be seen?
Have you pressed play?
No, I haven't. Oh well, never mind. If you look at a map of the United States,
there it is. There it is. It's on the screen.
Oh, it's on the screen.
It is now. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay. Washington State is at the top left-hand corner, okay, of the United States. If you look at a map of the United States, then Washington State is the top left-hand corner. That map actually shows the whole United States, so you can see that. And then you go to Washington State there, and if you close in on Washington State a little bit closer, then Cowlitz County is down at the bottom left-hand corner of Washington State, which is at the top left of the United States. Actually, Mount St Helens is in the neighboring county of Skamania, but you approach it through Cowlitz County. Every road approaching it's through there. So there's an interstate running there and there. If you can see where my cursor is moving, it's going from Portland to Seattle, and so you get off the interstate there, where that little red dot is, which is the town of Castle Rock, which is where I live and where the centre is. And somehow I'm going to need to put this back to the way it was now. So
if you go to the top of the screen, it probably says stop share.
Oh yes, I can see it. Yeah. Okay. So there we are. We're back to that again now.
Great. That'll help people familiarise, and we'll talk about Mount St Helens a bit later. But yeah, maybe share a bit about your time in the UK speaking on creation, how you found that experience.
Yes. Well, I often tell people I've been speaking on creation and writing on creation for over 40 years. And despite being very old now, they think, well, how on earth can you do it for 40 years? And the answer is because I became a Christian at the age of 15. And it was very shortly after that, working at a Christian bookshop on Saturdays while I was in high school, working on Saturdays in a Christian bookshop in Ashton-under-Lyne, that I came across these weird people called creationists. And particularly impressed by a book called Creation or Evolution by Professor H. Enoch, and then I got onto Henry Morris's material, and especially the Genesis record. That had not long been out at the time. I'm thinking about this had been about 1978 that I was in that bookshop, and Henry Morris's book, The Genesis Record, a one-volume commentary on the whole of Genesis, was published in 1976. So yeah, I spent quite a bit of my career, 20 years nearly, as a school teacher. But the point is, on the side, I was speaking and writing on the subject of creation in various local churches and so on. And after I left teaching and got into running a business, I was able to travel around a bit more and speak a bit more, and eventually Dr. Monty White, who was heading up Answers in Genesis UK at that time, invited me to join the ministry as a speaker, and that was the beginning of my full-time work as a speaker and writer on creation. So yeah, I did that for about 6 years, and then moved to the United States. I was 3 years in Pensacola and Florida, working for the Creation Today ministry with my friend Eric Hovind, and then was asked to take over this small ministry in Washington State. So this is a one-person ministry. It's just me, but it's we get a lot of visitors from all over the place coming to the Pacific Northwest to find out what's been going on at the mountain.
Great. And so I remember, I think the first time I came across you is when I heard a talk you gave in response to the famous atheist Richard Dawkins when he released his book, The God Delusion. And you had, I think, done a talk called Deconstructing Dawkins. And I think you have an interesting story about when actually Richard Dawkins was present for one of your presentations on his book. So you want to tell us a bit about that, what happened?
I mean, I was impressed very quickly with two things about Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. I was actually looking forward to it with trepidation, thinking, this is one of the major thinkers in the world. So not that I expected he was going to undermine my faith, but I thought, there's going to be some very difficult arguments here that we as Christians are going to need to tackle. So I got a copy of the book fairly early on, and I was impressed with two things about the book. First, how unscientific it is, and how it was not difficult to find the flaws in it after all. And I still say he is one of the great minds of atheism in the world. Yeah. And if even he cannot therefore produce coherent arguments for atheism, then those arguments clearly do not exist. And I was also impressed with the fact that his arguments being incoherent were illogical. You can use his book as a lesson in logic, and all the as illustrations of the logical fallacies, which I do in the talk. The second half of the talk, Deconstructing Dawkins, is about logical fallacies, illustrating every single one of them from the book, The God Delusion. The other thing about it is the fact that if he was going to criticize a biblical theology, which he does in the book, then he ought to have done some reading on it. And it's quite clear that he hasn't. He doesn't understand these things. I was presenting this talk. I was due to present the talk at a church in North London. And the Channel 4 company were doing a documentary series with him on the sort of evidences for evolution. And the producer of the program contacted me to ask me if I would mind him coming to, if the film crew could come and film the talk. Now, I was very wary about that because I know that they very much cherry pick these things. So actually, having consulted the elders of that church, we actually turned them down. We said no. Okay. We said, we'll let you do the talk if you allow us to see the final edit that you're going to put in the program before you broadcast it, and we will base our permissions to use those sequences on that, with the possibility that we might say, no, we don't want that used. They actually said then we cannot do that, we need to have full editorial control. So we again then said, in that case, you're not coming, you're not going to film the talk. And they, believe it or not, backed down. And they agreed, they signed with us that we could do exactly as we'd said and have the final editorial control over it, which is very unusual, but they wanted to broadcast it. So on the day they came to the church, they had to hand waivers out to all the audience, and then after they'd set all the cameras up, we set up cameras. Now, I'm not an expert on these things, but we had set up cameras so that we could record an unedited version. And I told them that, if there's any difference between what you do and what we do, we will release the unedited version on YouTube. So anyway, they went ahead with that. They weren't too happy, but they worked around it. And then the producer said, well, we've got Richard Dawkins in the van outside. He wonders if he could come in and listen to the talk. So we said, this is an open church. The pastor of the church said that straight away. This is an open church. We, obviously everyone's allowed in. So yes, of course he's allowed in. So he did come in and he listened to the talk. which is significant because one of the points in the talk, I tackled the issue in the book where he says there is no evidence that Jesus believed himself to be the Son of God, or ever compared himself with God. And I took him through the comparison in the talk. I go through the comparison of Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. You know, basically the Yahweh, the I am is my shepherd, comparing with John chapter 10, which I know you know very well, but I'm just saying it just for listeners to get the hang of that. That in John chapter 10, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. And of course, that chapter ends with them picking up stones to stone him. Why? Because this is one of the things that they knew straight away. They didn't require going through the process of understanding why, when it says in our English translations, Lord with 4 capital letters, 3 small capital letters, why that means the I am. But the point is that the Jesus is here as speaking Aramaic would have understood this straight away. Jesus is basically acknowledging openly that he's God, which is why they pick up stones, because stoning is the punishment for blasphemy. So Jesus knew what he was saying. Not only that, but all the people listening to him knew what he was saying. This was not done in secret. Jesus was claiming to be God. There are plenty of other passages we both know, but I use that one. And yet, just, this is after the talk, Dr. Dawkins said to me that he thought I'd been very fair. Okay? Yet 6 months later, I heard him doing a live interview on the BBC where he again came out with this nonsense that Jesus never claimed to be God. So and that just shows that he's not listening.
So he wasn't convinced.
Well, not only is he not convinced, he went through this very carefully. I saw he was taking notes. The point is he didn't listen because he doesn't care.
He doesn't want to.
This is why. I once saw an article on logical fallacies, and I probably ought to know where it is. I could probably Google it and look it up again. But this particular article on logical fallacies was very good. It explained all the logical fallacies. And then in the second half of the article, I haven't gone through those, it said, now we want to show you how to use those to win debates. That's basically what he's doing. He doesn't care whether something's a logical fallacy or not. He will use it to pull the wool over people's eyes, to convince them. He's leading people astray.
And I guess that's important for people to understand, because it's not really, not always about the evidence. It's about the worldview clash, and people don't want to give up their worldview, right?
It's not about the evidence at all. I remember that very clearly when I was in watching behind the camera of a debate between my friend Cy ten Bruggencate and a well-known British atheist. His name I've forgotten. I know it was Paul something or other, but it was interesting that this gentleman actually admitted in the discussion that it was not about the evidence, because he said something like, even if he had a signed affidavit from all the Roman soldiers who had put the stone against the tomb, and that there was no way that Jesus could have come out, and a signed affidavit from all those who had seen him after he'd risen, he said he still wouldn't believe it because it's not about the evidence.
So, I mean, if people want to watch that talk, you can just go to YouTube, type in Paul Taylor, Deconstructing Dawkins. Very interesting talk, very good talk. You'll learn a lot as you listen.
Yeah, I hope people will perhaps go to our website and get the purchased HD version, because that will support our ministry. There is a pirated version on YouTube. That's true. But, the purchased version is on our website, mshcreationcenter.org.
Okay, so we'll link to that in some of the comments below. I'll get that off Paul. Get it off Paul and help support the ministry. But if you watch that talk, I think you helpfully point out to people the nature of the creation debate. And one of the people you bring up in there is a man called James Hutton. And most people will have heard of Richard Dawkins, not Richard Dawkins, Charles Darwin, but they won't have heard of James Hutton and why he's important to this whole debate of creation and the flood, the age of the earth. Do you want to tell us a bit about James Hutton and why it's important for people to understand what he taught and the arguments he used?
I do recall not long after I started working for Answers in Genesis UK in 2005, chatting to our mutual friend, Dr. Andy McIntosh, and he said that in his view, the most serious problem today in apologetics, in creation ministry, is not really the theory of evolution, serious as that is. It's the belief in deep time. It's the belief in the millions of years, which evolution requires. But the idea of millions of years came well before the theory of evolution.
Yeah.
Darwin was born in 1809, and it was in the 18th century, in the 1700s, 1797, when James Hutton died. James Hutton was a man interested in geology in Scotland, in Edinburgh, in Scotland. He looked at various sites around Edinburgh, and in particular, two rock formations near Edinburgh. One is Salisbury Crag, and the other is Sycamore Point. Sycamore Point is about 9 miles east of Edinburgh, and is the one that he wrote most on, and it's a very interesting place to have a look at. Salisbury Crag is easier to get at, because if you go on any open-top tour bus around Edinburgh, they will stop at Sycamore Point. And in fact, the place where they stop is always very interesting, because ahead of you, you can see Holyrood Palace, where the Queen stays when she's in Edinburgh. To the left of you, you can see Britain's ugliest building, which is the Scottish Parliament. And to the right of you, so close to the city centre of Edinburgh, Americans would call downtown Edinburgh, right there, close by, is Salisbury Crag. And it was by looking at the layers of the rocks in Salisbury Crag, you could see lower layers, which are more or less vertical, very nearly vertical. And then there is an unconformity where those rocks have been eroded away. And then on top of that, a number of very nearly horizontal layers above. And James Hutton's idea, looking at those, was that the lower layers must have been laid down over millions of years, and then eroded over a period of millions of years, and then the nearly horizontal rock layers laid down over millions of years on top of that. By the way, his views are not what modern-day geologists would believe, where they put the age of the Earth at 4.5 billion years. His view was that the Earth was infinitely old.
Yeah,
and this cycle was always going on. So that, when people quote him favorably, you need to bear that in mind. His views were not the same as modern geologists, but nor were his views particularly sensible or scientific. And the reason for that is that there's a much better explanation, which is that the lower rocks must have been laid down quickly and then turned during the volcanic activity of the beginning of the flood, turned by nearly 90 degrees, then eroded fast. And it had to be fast because the unconformity is smooth. And you don't get smooth unconformity, smooth erosion, if it takes place over a long period of time. Even if it had taken 100 years, let alone millions of years, even if it's taken 100 years, you would have had a random and jagged erosion. So the fact you've got a smooth erosion means that it couldn't even have been 100 years. It had to be hours, basically. And the only way that you could get enough force of water to erode such a large amount of rock so rapidly is that water would have had to have had enough power to be covering the entire Earth. In other words, it's the global flood. So what we see at Salisbury Crag and at Sycamore Point is evidence that is completely consistent only with a worldwide flood approximately 4,500 years ago that would have been taking place over a rapid period of time. So the horizontal layers on the top would have been laid down towards the end of the flood as you were getting the last few layers of sediment settling out.
Yeah, and so if you live in England, it's worth going, or Scotland, it's worth going to see Sycamore Point. But
absolutely,
I think he also laid down a principle which many people may be unaware of how to interpret things. I think in one of his quotes, he talks about the fact that you can only interpret the layers by what's happening now, and any interpretation of things has to be naturalistic.
And of course, his great disciple was why is my brain not working? This is what happens when you get old, Simon. Don't get old. There's two things happen to you when you get old. One is that you begin to lose your memory. and I can't remember the other one. But yeah, it was Charles Lyell. Thank you for that. Yeah, it was Charles Lyell, his great disciple, and his view was, his famous quote was that the present is the key to the past.
Yeah.
And of course it isn't. It's quite obviously not, because you cannot do science that tells you a scientific experiment here and now that tells you definitively what happened in the past, not unless you're Doctor Who and you can travel back in time to find that out, which of course we can't.
Yeah.
Even though I know Ken Ham has a Doctor Who TARDIS iPhone case, you know, I know he and I are both great fans of Doctor Who, but we can't go back in time and do an experiment there. So all you can do is do experiments in the present and then assume that those results apply to the past, which they don't, and so often they do not. So in fact, the present is not the key to the past. Revelation is the key to the past. We can only find out what's in the past by what we are told definitively by someone that we trust.
Yeah, and it's important, I think, for people to understand that when people like Hutton and Lyell were saying you can only interpret the rock layers naturalistically, they were basically saying, look, you cannot appeal to the Bible, supernatural revelation.
Yes. And can we add to that the fact that Hutton's ideas were proved very popular to a number of other thinkers in Scotland at the time, one of whom would have been Thomas Chalmers.
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Chalmers is a great and godly man. When we get to heaven, he'll be a lot closer to the throne than me. He wrote a lot of very important theological stuff that's well worth reading, but he did make a mistake on this point. He was influenced by the ideas of James Hutton, and this was before before anyone was thinking of bringing evolution into religious ideas here at this point. But he brought deep time in, which is again confirming what Andy McIntosh said about this being the biggest problem, because this is what started the compromise. People like Chalmers, he was so convinced that these millions of years must be true, that the only way he felt he could reconcile that with a Bible that teaches 6 days of creation was that there must have been a millions of years gap at the beginning of the book of Genesis. In other words, Thomas Chalmers, the godly founder of the Free Church of Scotland, invented the gap theory, the idea that there must be this huge gap between the first and second verses of Genesis, into which we'll put all those millions of years, and that the fossils must have been made there, presumably by some strange flood, Luciferian flood, to explain the fossils. And again, as our friend Ken Ham often says, why do you use a flood that the Bible doesn't talk about to explain the fossils when we can very easily explain most of the fossils by a flood that the Bible does talk about? Yeah.
And I guess when you think about Chalmers and the Free Church of Scotland, if you look at the Free Church of Scotland now, it's basically non-existent and doesn't really have any biblical authority to it. So there are consequences to compromising the word of God.
There are indeed, though there are a couple of churches that I have spoken at when I was with Answers in Genesis who take a strong godly and biblical position on a literal 6-day creation just 6,000 years ago. So there are some good churches there. Yeah.
And so let's think about Mount St Helens, because one of the great evidences of the fact that it doesn't take millions of years to form rock layers comes from Mount St Helens. So maybe if you could just tell people why Mount St Helens, what is Mount St Helens, why it's important to this whole issue of the age of the earth and creation and the flood.
Mount St Helens is one of the volcanoes in the Great Ring of Fire, that's all around the Pacific Ocean, and particularly in North America, southern British Columbia, and through Washington State and Oregon State and into Northern California. You have a range of mountains there called the Cascades. These are west of the Rockies. There's a range of mountains called the Cascades. It's interesting when you see these from the air as you fly into Portland or Seattle, you can very clearly see them, that the mountains are pretty high, but then every so often you get these much higher mountains sticking up through them, and they are volcanoes. So what's happened there, here's the geology that we'll all agree with, is that these volcanoes are formed by subduction processes. So you've got a small tectonic plate off the coast of Washington and Oregon called the Juan de Fuca plate. And the Juan de Fuca plate She's named after the Spanish explorer Juan de Fuca.
Mm-hmm.
The Juan de Fuca plate is subducting under the North American plate like that. And there's a great deal of friction is happening here, so that inland, then about 100 miles inland, you've got molten lava under the surface which comes through, and you get a volcano. You get this eruptions, volcanoes coming through. Not volcanoes producing lots of lava. These are volcanoes that tend to produce steam explosions. They're heating up a lot of water that eventually detonates, and you get to some thick lava coming out, making a layer. So you get volcanoes building up like onions.
Mm-hmm.
The stratovolcanoes, and you've got a number of these in the Pacific Northwest. Mount St Helens is, these are all active volcanoes. Mount St Helens is the most active one of them, and it erupted explosively on May the 18th, 1980. Now, what's particularly interesting about the eruption in 1980 is that presumably we can say that the lava plug at the top of the volcano must have been a bit too difficult to remove, rather as if you were heating a pressure cooker up. But the safety valve was completely, and I'm not recommending you try this as an experiment, don't. It did happen to my mother, interestingly enough, once, but fortunately she was safe. But if the safety valve was completely clogged up, then clearly the pressure would build up and build up and build up until the pressure cooker itself exploded sideways. Mm-hmm. Okay, an opening would come out, and that's what happened to Mount St Helens. So the blast was a lateral blast along the ground, and it knocked down trees. It ripped up the trees from their roots, from just above their roots, and it did that up to 17 miles away from the volcano, north of the volcano. 230 square miles of forest was completely devastated. And there was a lot of ash being blown up into the air, 15 miles upwards into the atmosphere, mm-hmm. because after the lateral blast, then it was able to erupt more normally, if you like, upwards. So you got that ash that blew, in fact, eventually some of the ash blowing eastwards. That was the prevailing wind. Got into the jet stream, blew around the world. There was some Mount St Helens ash turned up on the coast of Washington State, believe it or not, that had blown all the way around the world. So it was a devastating eruption, and yet Mount St Helens is not a very big volcano. Even before the eruption, it was only 9,700 feet. Well, Mount Rainier, the tallest volcano in the Cascades, is 14,000 feet. Wow. There are plenty of mountains in the Rocky Mountains much higher than that, with non-volcanic mountains. Yeah. So these are not terribly big things. The Mount St Helens was not that big, but the amount of devastation it produced was amazing. Mm-hmm. Now, not only did it produce this blast, but also there was a landslide out of the north of the volcano. The world's largest recorded landslide occurred. The landslide moved at 150 miles per hour, so it's pretty fast. The blast, which was released straight after the landslide, was moving at 350 miles per hour, so it quickly overtook the blast, knocked down trees on the hills. The landslide came out. There's a lake to the northeast of the volcano called Spirit Lake. That was pushed out in a huge wave 800 feet up the hillside opposite, where all the trees had already just been knocked down. So the water picked up a lot of those trees and washed back down 500 feet. And the reason why it only came down 500 feet is because 300 feet of landslide had filled that lake in. So the new Spirit Lake is now 300 feet higher, not 300 feet deeper. In fact, the bottom of the lake is still 300 feet above where the lake used to be. There used to be hotels and campsites and lodges and things around that lake. There was even one man who refused to be evacuated. It's called Harry Truman. Okay. That's not the former president, a different Harry Truman. But he refused to move, and he is presumably still there, 300 feet below. So there's huge amounts of devastation. The valley between there's a ridge about 5 miles north of the volcano, and there's a steep-sided, very deep steep-sided valley between the two, or it was a steep-sided valley where the North Fork Toutle River flowed. That was filled up to a depth of 600 feet by the landslide. Now, in that 600 feet, 2 years later, the last of the series of eruptions, a small eruption, happened in 1982, and that caused a mud flow, a hot mud flow, which flowed through that valley and carved out a canyon. And that canyon is very similar in shape to the Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
That itself is important because that canyon took just 9 hours to carve, not millions of years. Okay. What it revealed is also important, though. By the way, that canyon has a stream flowing through the bottom of it now, but the stream did not carve the canyon. Just as in the same way, we do not think the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon. We think the Grand Canyon was carved by massive amounts of water, either at the end of the flood or maybe shortly after the flood. Maybe trapped flood waters being released later could have carved the canyon. But anyway, it's as a direct result of the flood, we think. And then the Colorado River would have flowed through the canyon afterwards, taking the point of least resistance. And so we've got a laboratory there at Mount St Helens that shows us a possible way this could have happened. Okay. Then another thing that we noticed there is that that canyon revealed rock layers, sedimentary layers 25 feet thick, at least 200 layers. And those layers we know were produced by the second major eruption of the volcano, which would have been on June the 12th, 1918. Yeah. So, because you can see the evidence, first of all, of the stuff that doesn't seem to have any shape from the May 18th eruption. Then the June 12th eruption produced pyroclastic flows that settled into layers, as I said, 25 feet thick. Now, those layers did not take millions of years to form. Those layers took 3 hours to form. Wow. So you've got two things there that are interesting. A third thing that's interesting, I mentioned all those trees picked up by Spirit Lake. Mm-hmm. Well, they got wet. They gradually get wet. And they get wet, mostly they take in water from the ends where the roots used to be, the root ball. And that means that eventually those trees get heavier at the root end. So if my arm is the tree, my elbow is the roots, that means that begins to sink and the other end floats. So eventually the tree is vertical. And as it gets even more waterlogged, so that all the air in it has taken up water, all the air spaces have taken up water, they actually sink. And down at the bottom of Spirit Lake, you can find trees vertical with the root ball at the bottom, but no extensive roots. And they're there. There's lots of them at a number of different levels at the bottom of Spirit Lake. Well, we see that all over the world. I often show people pictures of the 27 layers of so-called fossil forests at Specimen Ridge in the Yellowstone National Park. I often show people that, but you know, you see the same sort of thing in Britain. For example, if you go down Big Pit or any of those sort of places in South Wales, you will see fossil trees through the layers of coal. There's also the fossil forest off the coast at Borth near Aberystwyth. These sort of things can be seen in Britain too. So you don't need to travel to the United States to see those, but Mount St Helens gives an explanation. You see, those forests are not forests at all. They never grew there. Those trees did not grow there. They were transported there and they sunk vertically through the water. And in fact, we can explain all these other things by saying that they happened during the flood. The trees must have grown somewhere else, been ripped off their roots, carried around on the flood, and eventually towards the end of the flood, as the waters were less the currents were less, there was a bit more peacefulness about the flood water as it began to go down, and at that point trees would have been able to turn vertically and sink vertically and land in the sediment on different layers. So those different layers are not different eras, they're simply different places where the trees have landed. Yeah.
And so what impact did it have any impact on the sort of secular geological community and how they understand how layers are laid down really quickly, or have they just ignored it basically?
I spent 20 years as a school teacher teaching science in various different schools around Britain, and of course one of the things that we're expected to teach quite rightly to children is that you build up a hypothesis based on the evidence that you see. When you then find one piece of evidence that doesn't fit with your hypothesis, then you reject the hypothesis. That's what we teach kids, don't we?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it never happens in practice, does it? Because people have too much invested in the hypothesis. So when the one piece of evidence comes along that completely undermines the hypothesis, instead of rejecting the hypothesis, they use a coping factor. The theory of evolution I've often likened to a student car. You know what I mean? My student car.
Yeah.
When I was at university, which was back in the Middle Ages, not many students had cars. There were four of us. Only one of us in the accommodation had a car. And when the bumper fell off the car, he tied it on with string. And when the window wouldn't wind up properly, he held it up with duct tape. And when the exhaust fell off, he tied that back on with string. And before long, the car is held together with string and duct tape. The theory of evolution is held together with metaphorical string and duct tape, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's what's happened at Mount St Helens. You see that immediately. You go to any of the other visitor centres, and there are quite a few around Mount St Helens. You go to any of the other visitor centres, you'll find them say things like, normally these processes take millions of years, but surprisingly, here it happens straight away.
Yeah.
And I kid you not, that is what they say. So no, it has not changed their idea. They simply now talk about, for example, the main video at the Johnston Ridge Observatory, the main visitor centre that looks out over the volcano. They say that they talk about Mount St Helens eruption being part of the never-ending cycle of destruction and renewal. That's how they do it. So it's more like a sort of punctuated evolution view of geology. That's basically what they've applied. Stephen Gould's punctuated evolution really to geology. But instead of things moving gradually and smoothly, they now say they move in little jumps, and Mount St Helens is one of those little jumps. And it's nonsense. It doesn't fit with that concept. It really can only be explained by a catastrophic model. And of course, it's not the only thing that you can see in the Pacific Northwest that fits with a catastrophic model. It's just very, very common.
So really, it's another way really to ignore the fact that God flooded the world in the days of Noah through the global flood.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I remember being told for many years by skeptics, and particularly by theistic evolutionary Christians, as you know, are often far more vociferous in their rejection of biblical creation than atheists are.
A lot of atheists.
Yeah, and one of the things is, well, if there had been a worldwide flood, the world couldn't ever have recovered from it, because the devastation would have meant, things couldn't grow, and so it just doesn't fit. And of course, it's interesting, therefore, that I've got newspaper articles showing that scientists said after the May 18th eruption in 1980 that there was no way anything would grow in that entire area for at least 1,000 years. President Carter, visiting the area, famously said that he'd been told the area looked like the surface of the moon, but he said no, it makes the surface of the moon look like a golf course. And he was right to make that comparison, really, because the photographs show it as devastating. Yeah. But serious scientists at the time said it would take 1,000 years for anything to grow. And I love to take people on a little trail over a place called the hummocks, and I'll take them through the woodlands, and eventually there's one point in the heart of the woodlands where there's a nice little wooden bridge been built over this stream. One of my biologist friends has told me there's 7 different species of ferns in that valley. I stop people around there. I just get them to listen to the trickling of the water, the sounds of the wildlife around the hummocks, are these sort of small hills around the area. Everything looks so peaceful, and you're in the middle of a thick woodland. And I say to them, how many centuries has this woodland been here? And then suddenly the penny drops, because of course the hummocks are part of the landslide.
Yeah.
They are the places where bits of the landslide lost energy. If you sort of pour a bag of flour down a slope, unlike a true liquid, it will behave like a fluid, but unlike a true liquid, it will stop in lumps near the bottom. That's what happened at the hummocks. The landslide moved like a fluid, but you get these lumps there. And of course, this is exactly the area that I take people on a walk into. This is exactly the area where the scientists said nothing's going to grow for 1,000 years. And 40 years on, just 40 years on, I can take people into thick woodland with a nice stream and wildlife and flora and fauna, and it's only been there less than 40 years, and it looks like it's been there forever.
Yeah, I guess it shows how a certain worldview can hinder science because they're wrapped up in evolution. They think, well, it's going to be such a long time, it's devastating.
Yeah. And really where I was going with that is if that happens there, you can see that that could easily happen worldwide as well.
Yeah.
And the world would have easily recovered faster than people expect.
So just thinking finally, what application does Mount St Helens have for, the creation or the flood model for biblical creationists?
A couple of years ago, one lady who came on one of our excursions, after the excursion, she said, she thanked me, she said she'd really enjoyed the excursion. And she said, I did believe in what Genesis says before, I was already a creationist, she said, but if possible, I believe it more now. She said, when you see Mount St Helens and the things that have happened there rapidly, it's almost as if you can reach out and touch the book of Genesis. And that's become the tagline of our ministry since then, because that is really what's so useful for people to come and see Mount St Helens. Because these things, there are plenty of things around the world that we will interpret catastrophically, such as the trees in the old coal mines in South Wales, the fossilised forest at Borthwick, and many other places around the world, around Britain, around America, and so on. But Mount St Helens, we have got eyewitnesses who are still alive. That's not going to go on forever, but I've got these things. Modern technology means I've got them recorded. One of my displays in the Mount St Helens Creation Centre is an antique radio that I've sort of cannibalized, and I've built a player inside it to play two MP3 files of two men who survived the effects of the eruption, and incidentally, these two men, both of them in their different ways, were led to the Lord by the events of the Mount St Helens eruption. And they are eyewitnesses, and of course we've got those recorded, and no one can deny it. We've got them recorded and we play them, and at the moment both those men are still around. We could interview them again, but at least those interviews will remain. There are eyewitness accounts, and it's within people's lifetimes that these things happened. So they did not happen, additionally, in the way that evolutionary scientists expected. But one person said to me once, what's the difference between what you say here? Is there one word that sums up the difference between what you say in the Mount St Helens Creation Centre and what the other visitor centres say? And I thought for a bit, and I realised immediately what the word was. I said, it's the word surprising. Said, because we are awestruck by what happened at the eruption, yes, but we're not surprised, because we've got the biblical interpretation that helps us understand it. They're all surprised, and that's what they say. These things took millions of years, but we're surprised because they happened quickly. We're not surprised because we never expected them to take millions of years. Our time scale shows that they could happen fast.
Yeah, so it's a great way to help people, especially young people, understand if the flood happened, this is sort of the effect it would have had. Not if the flood happened, but the fact that the flood happened, it did have devastating effects.
That's right. And obviously, being very old, the majority of people who come to visit me were born after the 1980 eruption. I understand that and I recognize that, but they also recognize that there are people they know who were very familiar with what happened and who were eyewitnesses to the events.
Yeah. I was only 11 months at the time, so yeah.
So it had a great impact on you then.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, I wasn't there. People often ask me, was I there? And of course I wasn't, but I was at university. I do remember watching it on the news.
Yeah, because it was worldwide news, wasn't it? It did make the worldwide
It was.
news.
No, it didn't. Although I was a creationist at the time, and involved in the Christian Union at Nottingham University where I was, it didn't, in 1980 it didn't have an impact on me, but I left the university in 1984. I had joined the Biblical Creation Society, and I was actually on the committee of the Biblical Creation Society. One of the other committee members had been over to Mount St Helens, accompanied by Dr. Steve Austin, the creationist who's done most of the geological research around Mount St Helens, and whose book I can see in the background just behind you there. And he came back with, now you'll obviously not remember these things, but he came back with a pile of 35mm slides. Okay, that's what we used to have before PowerPoint. I know you don't remember that, but, no. But he showed us these slides, and the point was, of course, he'd had to do a lot of hiking because the road hadn't been rebuilt to the mountain then, so it had been a long trek. But he came back and he was saying that there is something special going on there at Mount St Helens. There are these things that cannot be explained by evolutionary timescale, but which fit with a creationist timescale, have happened in a manner very similar, not identical, but very similar to what we think happened at the time of the flood. So from 1984 onwards, I have been interested in what happened at Mount St Helens. I never dreamed that I was ever going to get to the United States to see it, still less that I would run a creation ministry nearby at that time, but you can see why when this post was offered, it was something that I jumped at the chance of doing, because Mount St Helens has been so important to everything that I've said about the flood for decades.
Yeah, I guess if you're thinking of going on holiday to the States, you want to go and visit Mount St Helens, because it would be a terrific experience.
I would recommend it, and you know, Mount St Helens is not the only thing to see here. There's a lot of other interesting things. It's not the only thing to see from a creationist viewpoint. It is the only one that's got eyewitnesses, but you know, just an hour's drive away from here, you can get to the beautiful Columbia Gorge, where there's clear evidence of catastrophic events associated with the Missoula flood, as well as seeing absolutely spectacular scenery there. If you're interested in history, you know, there's the Lewis and Clark expedition. There's lots here within an hour's drive that would fill up a 2 or 3 week vacation easily. But Mount St Helens needs to be the centerpiece of it. And I take people around 3 different sides of the volcano. You know, the most popular one is the west side, because that's where they've made the roads.
Yeah.
And that's where I take most of the people. But also I sometimes take people around the south side. Now, the volcano erupted northwards, so there was very little devastation around the south side, which means you can see what the old growth forest looked like. It's still there on the south side. Plus, you can also see a lot of evidence of a catastrophe that happened about 2,000 years ago, where there was obviously a big eruption, produced a large lava flow. There's a huge lava cave there, lava tube called the Ape Cave, and there's lots of interesting things, beautiful things to look at around the south. Around the east of the volcano, which is very remote and takes a long time to get to, because it's so remote, they didn't clear things up after 1980. So around the east side, it looks like a dystopian landscape. Yeah. Where you can actually still see scorched trees still standing after 40 years, dead for 40 years. They're still there. And that weird landscape is very instructive indeed. In many ways, that's my favorite side of the volcano. Yeah. But it takes a whole day to get around there and back again, because it's in a very remote area.
Right. Well, thanks, Paul, for joining us, tonight, but this is going to be released in a day. But it's been a pleasure having you with us. I'm sure people have learned and been informed about what we've discussed. And if you want to know more, I'll put a link in the comment section when we post this to Mount St Helens Creation Center. And please do take a look and inquire more into what happened at Mount St Helens, because it'll be great for your creation apologetics. So thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much for having me. God bless you.
Yeah, God bless everyone, and take care.